All right, time to revisit this idea of filter context. Now, I told you this was one of those top 5 most critical concepts in the course, so it's worth revisiting. We're going to dive in quite a bit deeper now. So, as a reminder, measures are always calculated based on filter context. And simply put, filter context is the set of filters or coordinates that are determined by a pivot table's layout. So, what fields you've got on filters, whether you have any slicers in there, if you're breaking down your data by row labels or by column labels, all of those things that determine a pivot table's layout or orientation impact the values that the measures are going to show. And this is nothing new. This is just like how the value fields in a regular pivot table work. But what we need to understand about Power Pivot is that each measure cell within the pivot table calculates independently, and it calculates based on its coordinates. So think of each cell in a pivot table as its own little island. It doesn't know the value in the cell above it or next to it or beneath it. Even the grand total rows are islands. And so when you make any sort of change to a pivot table layout, maybe you change the value in a filter, you drag your row labels from column labels, you pull a set of row labels out, anything that changes the view forces every cell in the pivot to detect its brand new coordinates and then recalculate its value. So quick example here. Take a look at this simple view, just 2 columns. We've got our total quantity measure as values, and we've got customer city as row labels with a grand total row. Now, if we drill in and isolate one cell in that view, let's take this one, for instance, 52,888 in the Hidalgo row. The coordinate for this particular cell is customer lookup table, customer city column equals Hidalgo. Pretty straightforward. That makes sense. That's the only filter based on the view we're looking at that's going to impact what value this measure returns. Now, what's going on behind the scenes is a little bit more complicated. Given that coordinate, what Excel is basically doing in the background almost instantaneously is it's drilling down that customer lookup table, filtering down to just the rows where customer city equals Hidalgo. And then here's where it gets a little bit new. After filtering the customer lookup table, those filter settings flow to any related tables downstream based on the relationships in the data model. So those relationships essentially transmit the filters from the customer lookup table to any table related downstream. And since the transactions data table is related to the customer lookup table and it's downstream, that means that the filters applied to the customer lookup table are then also applied to the transactions table. And from there, the measure runs its arithmetic or its operation based on that set of filtered rows, and it returns the result. So that's a lot of words, kind of makes your head spin a little bit. Trust me, it takes some time to really understand and let this stuff sink in, but I'm going to give you more examples. We're going to dive into this more and more, and it's going to start to become kind of second nature over time. So stick with it. We got this. Let's look at one other example. If we isolate the grand total cell here, again, this cell does not add up the values above it because just like any other cell in the pivot, it's an island. So it doesn't say, let's take the sum of, A3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Instead, this represents a lack of filters. So even though there are row labels in this view for customer city, they don't affect the grand total row. So customer city is not a coordinate for this particular cell. So as a result, the total quantity measure evaluates against the entire unfiltered customer lookup table and therefore the entire unfiltered transactions table. And that's why you see the grand total there. So let's bounce over to Excel. I want to show you guys some of these views and walk us through a couple situations where we can get comfortable thinking about this filter context idea and practicing setting different views to create different types of coordinates. Okay, so here I am in my Food Mart data model. I'm in the pivot table view here. We've got our total quantity measure defined from the last lecture. And now why don't we start actually creating some pivot table views? I know you guys have been probably dying to get your hands dirty, so now that we've laid most of the foundation, we can start playing with this stuff. And the first thing we're going to do is pull a field from our store lookup table. And just a note, you'll see the hierarchy field that we created, store location, listed first. And then you'll probably see this collapsed folder that says more fields. So if you drill down into that folder, you'll see each individual column within our store lookup table. So let's grab store country and pull it into our row labels. And now we're breaking down the total quantity measure by store country. So at this point, nothing really groundbreaking. This is exactly how we deal with normal values in a pivot table. And just a quick check on the coordinates. This cell here, for instance, has one coordinate, and that coordinate is that store country equals Canada. One thing to note, if you don't see the header label here, one little tip, go into your pivot table tools, design tab, and under report layout, choose outline form. This is my favorite type of form. It's very similar to compact, but it offers more intuitive column headers. So I usually operate in outline form. So there you go. That's my coordinate for Canada. Store country equals Canada. Now, if we go ahead and access a different table, let's minimize store lookup, and let's go into our product lookup table. Again, we've got a hierarchy here, so you may need to drill into more fields. And why don't we pull product brand in to our row labels, and let's move store country into column labels. So now we're creating a little bit more of a complex view, and we've added a second coordinate to all of these cells that are calculating measures, and that would include grand totals as well. So take this cell, for instance, 2821. This cell has two coordinates that impact the value that it returns. The first is that store country from the store lookup table needs to equal USA. The second is that the product brand from the product lookup table has to equal atomic. And these two coordinates tell Excel exactly how to filter those lookup tables and any related table like transactions and which rows to evaluate this measure against. And the same goes if you add additional fields, like for instance, customer lookup. Why don't we grab gender as a filter? And so if we set that filter to only look at transactions among females in these countries among these products, now we've got a third coordinate for every one of these cells. So back to that same example, country USA, product brand atomic, and now customer lookup table gender column needs to equal female. So all of these lookups, 3 different lookup tables, are being filtered. Those filter coordinates and that filter context is streaming down to the related tables like the transaction table, and the result is being evaluated on a set of filtered rows. And that's the idea behind filter context. And to this point, it's not really any different from what you've seen with a regular pivot table, with the exception that we've pulled in fields from 3 separate tables, which in itself is pretty awesome when we really think about it. But this is the same way that, normal value cells in a traditional pivot table would operate as you change your pivot table view and your pivot table layout. Now, the reason we're going so deep into this, and the reason we're going to continue to talk about this in the next video, is that once you start writing DAX, you'll have the ability to actually modify and add and remove filter context to fully customize how you want these measures to calculate. And that's where having this fundamental understanding of filter context is so critical. Otherwise, we'll be completely lost. And in the next lecture, I'm actually going to guide you and walk you through step by step what this process is looking like behind the scenes.